There was once a spiritual method, so simple, so direct, and so dangerous to religious power that it had to be buried, not because it was false, not because it was evil, but because it worked too well. It gave ordinary people something institutions could not afford to let them keep: unmediated access to the divine. No priest standing between you and the sacred. No hierarchy guarding the gate. No ritual economy built on your fear, your guilt, or your hunger to be made worthy. Just one direct act, one sacred inscription, one living declaration that returns spiritual authority to the human being holding it. And once you understand that, everything changes. Suddenly the silences in history make sense. Suddenly the erasures make sense. Suddenly the machinery of religious control, the obsession with obedience, the fear of unauthorized contact with God, the suspicion toward direct spiritual experience, all of it begins to look less like protection of truth and more like protection of monopoly. Because the most dangerous thing a system can face is not rebellion, it is irrelevance. And this buried method threatened to make the entire structure of spiritual dependency unnecessary. That was the real threat. That was the forbidden thing. There are truths a system can tolerate as long as they remain abstract. It can survive ideas. It can survive poetry. It can even survive heresy. But what it cannot survive is a method. A method can be used. A method can be repeated. A method can spread from hand to hand without permission. And in the early mystical streams surrounding the Christian world, there existed one such method, not a theology, not a philosophy, not a distant hope, but a direct personal act, the handwritten sacred declaration, a phrase written by your own hand, carried on your body, not as decoration, not as superstition, but as an anchoring of identity. The claim was radical. When the human being remembers what they are in relation to the source, the machinery of spiritual domination begins to fail, and that is where this story becomes dangerous. Because if the soul can stand in direct alignment with the divine, then fear loses its leash. If the soul can be inwardly sealed by recognition rather than outwardly controlled by institution, then the middleman loses his throne. That is what was buried, not just a sentence, not just an object. A transfer of power. Think about the psychology of control. A dependent person is easier to manage than a sovereign one. A person who believes access to grace must be approved, filtered, and distributed by a sacred bureaucracy will keep kneeling at the right doors. They will keep paying, obeying, waiting, confessing, and doubting themselves. But a person who discovers that the deepest connection was never owned by the system in the first place becomes very hard to rule. That person may still pray, still love the sacred, still revere mystery, but they will no longer confuse God with the gatekeeper. And that distinction threatens every institution built on spiritual scarcity. For centuries, the public story was that certain teachings were removed because they were misleading, deviant, dangerous to the faithful. But beneath that explanation was another motive, older and colder. Control does not fear falsehood nearly as much as it fears independence. The problem with direct mystical methods was not that they led people away from the divine. The problem was that they led people around the system, around the authorized voices, around the controlled rituals, around the official channels. If an ordinary woman could sit at her table, take a blank piece of paper, inscribe a sacred declaration with her own hand, and feel clarity, inner protection, spiritual coherence, and a living nearness to the source without asking anyone's permission, then what exactly was the institution selling? And once enough people asked that question, the old structure would begin to crack. So the method was not merely criticized, it was minimized, mistranslated, hidden under layers of doctrine, replaced with safer forms that kept the gesture but removed the power. Spoken repetition was allowed. Handed-down formulas were allowed. Passive devotion was allowed. But the direct act of conscious inscription, the moment in which a person marks reality with the truth of their own divine origin, that had to be pushed into shadow. Because what they feared was not the words themselves, it was what the words made possible. The method was deceptively simple. That is why it survived in fragments. That is why it kept resurfacing. That is why it could never be fully destroyed. It required no temple, no relic, no expensive initiation, no rare object purchased through sacred authority, only clean paper, ink, and a sentence. A sentence meant to be written slowly, deliberately, by hand. I am of the living light, not printed, not typed, written. That was the key. The hand mattered, the act mattered. The physical tracing of meaning into matter mattered, because this was never just about language, it was about alignment. Ink on paper became a witness, a fixed pattern, a symbolic anchor, a small but potent joining of mind, body, and declaration. The ancient mystical understanding was simple. What is merely thought can drift. What is merely spoken can fade. But what is written with awakened intent enters form. It takes a place in the visible world. It becomes a threshold object, a point where inner recognition meets outer reality. And once that happens, the sentence is no longer only read, it is carried, it is held. It is kept near the body like a silent seal. This is why the method felt so threatening to systems of control, because it did not ask the believer to beg, it taught them to remember. Read that sentence again. I am of the living light. Notice what it does not say. It does not say, please choose me. It does not say, make me worthy. It does not say, I am broken and only an institution can restore me. It does not say, I must climb through rank, ritual, and approval before I can stand near the sacred. No, it begins with I am, presence, not pleading, being, not begging. Then comes of the living light, not separate from it, not exiled from it, not renting access to it, of it, emerging from it, bearing its signature. This is why the declaration was considered too empowering. If a person truly receives that idea, not as metaphor but as identity, then the old emotional control system starts collapsing from the inside. Shame weakens, fear loosens, manufactured unworthiness loses its spell, and once that spell breaks, dependency becomes much harder to maintain. This is the part many people have never been told. Your spiritual exhaustion may not be proof that you failed. It may be the result of being trained into distance from your own source. You were taught to doubt your direct knowing, taught to suspect your inner clarity, taught that if the sacred ever touched you without institutional mediation, it must be imagination, pride, or deception. Why? Because a person who trusts nothing in themselves becomes easy to govern. But the buried method begins reversing that condition immediately. Here is how it was done. Take a fresh, clean piece of paper, small enough to fold and carry. Use ink. Write the sentence slowly. I am of the living light. Do not rush. Let each word land. Let the hand move with attention, as if you are not inventing something new but recording something ancient that was always true before you were taught otherwise. When it is written, pause. Read it once in silence. Then fold it inward 3 times, each fold bringing the words closer to your center. Carry it with you, close to the body, in a pocket, wallet, or small pouch. That is the whole act. And precisely because it is so simple, it is difficult for the modern mind to believe it could matter, but that disbelief is part of the conditioning. We have been taught that power must be complicated, licensed, and far away. We have been taught to overlook the things that return agency too quickly. Yet the handwritten declaration works on a level deeper than performance. It creates what older mystical traditions understood as a personal seal of remembrance, a portable point of coherence, a symbolic imprint that interrupts fragmentation. In modern language, you might call it anchoring, pattern, reinforcement, coherence of identity. In older language, you would call it a seal against spiritual confusion, because confusion is one of the oldest tools of domination. Keep a person inwardly divided, and they remain controllable. Keep them doubting what they are, and they will surrender their center to louder voices. But a person carrying a living declaration of origin begins to reorganize from the inside. The static lowers. The self-betrayal weakens. False guilt becomes easier to recognize. Certain atmospheres stop hooking into them. Certain manipulations stop landing with the same force. Not because they have become superhuman, but because something in them has been brought back into alignment. And this is where the buried method becomes deeply personal. Maybe you were told your spiritual struggles happened because you lacked faith. Maybe you were told your confusion was a moral defect. Maybe you were taught to interpret your distance from God as evidence that something in you was inherently deficient. But what if the deeper truth is simpler and more unsettling? What if you were never meant to live in permanent spiritual dependency at all? What if the ache, the fatigue, the constant sense of reaching outward for permission were not signs of your weakness, but signs of a structure that needed you unsure of your own access? That is the wound this method answers. It does not flatter the ego, it does something more dangerous. It restores interior authority. It reminds the person that contact with the sacred does not begin when a system approves them. It begins when they remember what they are. This is why the method had to be buried beneath safer teachings. It was too portable, too human, too difficult to monetize, too easy to pass between ordinary hands. No marble sanctuary required, no clerical chain required, no elite language required, just a person, a page, a sentence, and the courage to carry what the system taught them to forget. And once a person does that, the story begins to reverse. They stop interpreting every hardship as proof of divine abandonment. They stop collapsing so easily under inherited shame. They begin to notice where fear had been confused with reverence, where dependency had been confused with devotion, where obedience had been confused with truth. This does not make them anti-sacred. It makes them harder to spiritually colonize. And there is a difference. The real danger of the buried declaration was never that it made people arrogant. The danger was that it made them inwardly free. A free soul can still love tradition, still honor mystery, still pray, still gather, still serve, but it will no longer kneel to structures that feed on estrangement. It will no longer mistake distance for holiness. It will no longer believe the divine requires a broker to recognize its own reflection in the human being. That is the revolution hidden inside this tiny act. The system is strongest when you forget who you are, strongest when you think your access must be rented, strongest when your deepest self feels unqualified to stand in the presence of the sacred without official supervision. But the handwritten declaration breaks that spell in the quietest possible way. It does not ask you to fight a cathedral. It asks you to stop surrendering your center. It asks you to carry one sentence that tells the truth more clearly than an empire of spiritual theater ever could. I am of the living light. That is the gift, not information, not entertainment, a method, a portable act of remembrance, a direct reclamation, something you can write tonight, something you can keep, something no institution can perform for you, because its power lies precisely in the fact that you do it yourself. So if something in you has always felt that the distance was artificial, if something in you has always suspected that the sacred was nearer than you were told, if something in you is tired of being trained into dependence and ready to remember its birthright, then begin there, with the paper, with the ink, with the sentence, not as superstition, as return. Because you were not weak, you were kept dependent, you were not abandoned, you were interrupted, and what was buried was not buried because it was empty. It was buried because it made ordinary people too difficult to control. Write it, fold it, carry it, let the old spell break. And if this truth reached something ancient in you, leave one quiet sign below. I remember, I remember, I remember.